Thanks very much, Karen. It's great to be here and great to talk to everybody. I've been with Birdwatch Ireland for almost 8 years now, and I've been working for the environment for over 25 years now as well. So hopefully I'll be able to do this a bit of justice. I probably have left out a few things just because there's so much you can talk about, but let's get going and I'll take you on a bit of a journey. So agriculture and biodiversity in Ireland. So just want to say a little bit about me. I grew up on a farm in County Limerick, a dairy farm, which I suppose I was mainly there, I suppose, in the 1980s, 70s and 80s. And my dad had 50 cows on 80 acres. And it was a fantastic childhood to grow up on a farm, and that's really where I first got my love for nature. So now biodiversity and farming in Ireland. So I've probably got three core messages to give you about our biodiversity as it relates to farmland. And this is just, the first thing is in the context that, you know, we have lost a lot of our woodland. I mean, the apex, I suppose, the habitat or ecosystem in Ireland would be woodland if the conditions were right for it. But we have had thriving farmland for many centuries, even millennia. Farming has been an important part of the Irish landscape and to feed people. So three messages from me from Birdwatch Ireland are, so traditionally we've had a very rich farmland biodiversity, but we have lost a lot. I'll outline the reasons for the loss, and I will outline that we can save it if we have the right policies and supports in place. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is always to start off with the science, and that's the foundation. So we got to listen to the science on biodiversity loss. So BOCI 4, what is this acronym? BOCI is the Birds of Conservation Concern in Ireland list. And in 2021, Birdwatch Ireland published its fourth BOCI assessment. So this is what we use at Birdwatch Ireland, as well as other survey data, to outline in a simple way the status of bird species, the regularly occurring bird species in Ireland. So the study is done by Birdwatch Ireland and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in Northern Ireland. So it's an all-island assessment of the status of birds. It's based on data from a variety of bird studies and monitoring schemes. And we use standard quantitative criteria at global, European and national level. And within Ireland, we look at historical declines, trends in population size and population range and other criteria. So basically we use a traffic light approach using red, amber and green to outline the status of the birds. So the green would mean that the species is not of concern, that it's not meeting the red and amber criteria. Amber listed species would be exhibiting moderate declines, so declines of between 25 to 49% over 25 years, and red listed species would be looking at severe declines of over 50% over 25 years, sorry. So in 2021, we published the fourth assessment of the 211 regularly occurring bird species. And you can see here with the pie chart that 26% of those are now red listed, with 37 amber listed. So 63% of the 211 bird species are in trouble. And that was pretty much the worst BOCI that we have ever reported on. And of course, we would then be very concerned of what's the next BOCI 5 going to look like, and that'll be coming out in about 2026. So let me just try and move this bar. So basically, here in this chart, you can see the movement of species going from BOCI 1, which was published in 1998, right through to BOCI 4, and you can see the increase of species moving onto the red list. And of course, this is just really, really worrying. I get my slide to move. Why isn't it moving? Slides are not moving, Karen. Let me just check again. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. So then when we look at firstly, the Bucky paper is on the Birdwatch Ireland website, and so you can look up bird conservation concern in Ireland, and you can see the paper that was published in Irish Birds Journal with all of the criteria and all the information about the different bird species. But in this chart, we're looking at the proportional status of species on the red, amber, and green lists by habitat type. So here you can see coastal, farmland, lowland, wetland, upland birds, urban and woodland birds listed, or these different groups. And so farmland birds and upland birds would be the ones that are most threatened. And I suppose in the upland areas, you can see that it's farmland, it's farmed as well. So that would indicate the impact of agriculture. So these are the birds of the red list, and the ones with the red text are those that are ground nesting. So the fastest worsening group of birds is farmland birds, especially of the lowlands. So the likes of curlew, twite, lapwing, snipe, corncrake, meadowpipit, windchat, golden plover, dunlin, for example, are those species. And I always think it's really important when you're showing like the data, just to show the faces of, you know, what we're talking about. And as you can see, like these are just beautiful, beautiful species. And yeah, they really are, they're worth protecting. Oh, the slides are coming again. Sorry, what's going on? Ooh. Sorry about this, folks. I don't know why am I, there we go. So in other words, yeah, here we go. They're disappearing. And here you can see just another representation of the data, just looking at the declines from the 1970s through to the 1910s. So this would be more bird atlas data we also undertake. And you can see like the catastrophic declines of curlew, or sorry, corncrake. We had corncrake present in many squares. It was widely distributed around the country in the 1970s, and right down to now it's been relegated to the very northwest of the country because it's just been squeezed out of the countryside. Same with curlew. But even in the 1990s, we had, you know, we still had quite a number of breeding pairs of curlew, and now we're down to maybe about 100 and 120 breeding pairs, which is just indicates a catastrophic loss, down from about 5,000 pairs. So the thing is about this is, so we knew of the historical losses of birds has been, you know, corncrake, curlew, you know, we know these species have been declining for a long time, and there has been insufficient action to recover species populations. But what's really kind of worrying is the last Bucky has shown that kestrel and, for example, a recently common widespread species is now declining as well. So since 1998, there's been a 45% decline in the kestrel. And that is really heartbreaking. So we believe that the loss of habitat for prey species is a key reason for this. So basically, again, the production focused in the wider countryside for agriculture and loss of habitat is just squeezing it out of the countryside. The countryside is becoming, in many ways, more homogenized with the specialization in agriculture. Also, though, we believe that the secondary poisoning from rodenticide is also a factor where the birds are eating prey species, mammals, small mammals that would be ingesting rodenticide, and then the birds eat the mammals, and they then get the secondary poisoning, which is a slow, painful death. So kestrel is also one of the birds in the Farmland Bird Index that's used across Europe to look at, you know, as an indicator of what's happening in agriculture policy. So that would tell you that there's things are not looking well there. Another species that showed up in Bucky 4 that was really of concern to us, because it was also much more widespread breeding wader, is the snipe. And we believe that small-scale drainage of wet grasslands is causing the impact here. So other stats in relation to agriculture, and I'm kind of giving you the big, you know, this is all of the bad news, I suppose. First, we know that 85% of our EU protected habitats in Ireland have bad or inadequate status, and that 70% of those are impacted negatively by agriculture practices. We've lost a lot of our lowland hay meadows, even since 2013, due to intensification and deforestation. 1/3 of our 99 wild bee species are threatened with extinction, and these would need, you know, flowers for nectar and food, you know, the poisoning as well, impacts from pesticide use. In relation to water quality, the National Parks and Wildlife Service Article 17 report to the European Commission on the status of protected species shows that for water dependent species, like we know about water quality problems in Ireland, but for water dependent species, so like kingfisher, dipper, grey wagtail, but also things like freshwater pearl mussel, and all the insects that all these animals rely on to eat, that the agriculture is also, it represents the highest percentage of high importance pressures relative to other categories, and this is predicted to increase over the next 12 years because of fertilizer and pollution, especially on targeted fish species. So basically what that's saying is that, you know, because of the time lag effect with the impacts of nutrients on water quality, that they're not expecting this to change in the near future. And we also know about the impacts of ammonia to habitats like peatlands, and then the impacts to the birds and the plants that use those habitats. So what is going on? Why is it happening? I mean, I just think it's really important when we're framing this discussion is just like, you know, not to blame the farmers as such. I don't think that's fair. Like, there's been a few things like, so basically what we're losing is habitats where we've got more pollution, where and these are driven by changes in agricultural policy, intensification of livestock production, specialization, and going back in time, maybe back in the 70s, it was like historical changes such as stopping, you know, moving from silage production from hay, making. And I'll tell you though, like from my own family background, from my father's experience, like he talked us out of ever moving into farming. He said it's the dead loss, don't do it, because it was getting harder and harder to make a living from it when you're a small farmer. And so farmers changed and they moved, and you know, people, the cheap food policy hasn't helped. When farmers were getting not very much for their produce, and so they needed to produce more. And so we're in a globalized market, and so the production of milk and beef has been, you know, there's global demand for those products. So this is all culminating that the cost, though, because price doesn't include the cost of the environmental damage that's happening, it's been left behind, and we're seeing further and further degradation. I would also say that there's a lack of adequate implementation of our national and EU laws as it relates to farmland, to farming, and that's something that needs additional attention. So what's the Birdwatch Ireland response to this? Well, in-house we have surveys and monitoring team that undertakes a range of surveys. These are ornithologists who are qualified to undertake these surveys, but we also have an extensive citizen science project, the Countryside Bird Survey and the Irish Wetland Bird Survey, where very skilled volunteers collect data, and it's processed and we can interpret the results and determine the trends that feed into reports like the Birds of Conservation Concern report and other surveys. We use GIS to map important areas for birds. We trial methods on how to address the impacts, including on our reserves. We publish papers in Irish Birds and other journals on our findings. We do active conservation work and roll it out and scale them up to try and stop the losses and restore populations. We undertake advocacy to ensure policies are the right ones to protect birds. And then we do education awareness raising and partnerships with people, including farmers working on the ground. So in terms of advocacy then, all our advocacy is based on the evidence. I mean, we don't say stuff that we can't stand over. So, you know, we'd be involved in the work on the Common Agricultural Policy and trying to input that and shape it. The Food Vision 2030 policy, water quality, nitrates, working on agri-environment schemes to shape them. Climate policy, biodiversity policy, afforestation policy, and legislation and enforcement. So what do we need then to try and restore these populations? I suppose because we have to prioritize our time and efforts, you know, we're focusing on the red-listed birds and how to stop the declines there. So to do that, we need to have healthy semi-natural grasslands, peatlands, wet grasslands to support them. So these are just some pictures of, like on the right is a nice wet grassland up in County Leitrim. So here are some other the species that are supported by these these habitats, including the marsh fritillary. You've got a red grouse here, hen harrier, corncrake, whinchat. They all support their own need species rich meadows. They also support things like, you know, the great yellow bumblebee and small white orchids. So when you start supporting habitats for the wild birds, which are maybe higher up on the food chain, you're supporting a range of plant and animal species. So it's not just all about the birds. We're supporting the habitats, which include, like, obviously habitats important for climate as well, such as peatlands and heathlands. Upland and coastal grasslands as well are really important for a range of breeding waders, and chough, which is that red-beaked crow-looking bird there in the lower left, and twite. So in order to do this, like I have mentioned grasslands quite a bit, so we need high nature value farming to support these habitats. So this would be low intensity, low input grazing, where it's cattle out in low stocked numbers, creating you know, tussocks of grass, creating kind of, I suppose, areas scattered with tussocks for birds for nesting, and the way they eat really suits supports the bird population. So here you'll see a nest on the ground. I'm not sure what that one is though, don't ask me. But especially for breeding waders, and I suppose for us at Birdwatch at the moment, the breeding waders are in the worst condition, and that's where we're putting a lot of focus. So breeding waders need wet grasslands. So there we were talking about lapwing, curlew, dunlin, redshank. All of these are in serious trouble. So again, we need cattle to be able to graze down the grass in these areas, but also the trampling creates muddy edges on these wet areas, which is essential for chick feeding, because the chicks then probe into the mud for invertebrates, and there's shallow pools created. And also just to note, my colleague Dave Sotheby in Termancara at our reserve over there told me that a lapwing will travel up to 2 kilometers with chicks in order to find cattle so that they can bring their chicks to the muddy patches that the cattle create. And I just thought that was astounding, because they obviously have to walk on roads and walk across fields and to try and get to these muddy areas. So that was pretty amazing to me. So just moving on then from the high nature value farming to talk about other aspects of the wider countryside. And barn owl, again, is a red listed species. Now we put satellite tracking device on a barn owl in 2017 in Cork. And we then downloaded the data to see where this bird goes in the wider countryside. And you can see from this picture, I hope you can see it okay, but it's a pretty intensive looking landscape. And there's all these dots, red, yellow, and orange dots. So the bird had been found by a farmer in his hay barn, and it was nesting there. And so my colleague John Lusby went and put the tracking device on the back of the bird, and it doesn't hurt them or anything like that. And then he downloaded this data. So basically the red dots show where the bird was stationary, the orange its foraging flight, and the yellow dots show where it was fast transit flight. So what this data shows is that the interior of the fields were largely ignored by the bird, and they were using hedgerows. And it just really, hedgerows to be stationary on, to look out and to try and detect prey, but also to travel along. So this just indicates the importance of hedgerows in our wider landscape, and how important it is that we have appropriate management of hedgerows to, make sure that they are in a good condition to support the range of insects, and then the small mammals and all the other species that you can find there. So you can see basically, oh, there's my cursor. You can see, like, these are the orange dots, which shows the foraging flights. And then you can, very few dots crossing the fields, but this is when it was coming back home to roost. So what is needed then? What's happening in terms of conservation work on the ground? Well, Birdwatch Ireland has been involved in results-based agri-environment schemes in Ireland, and these are targeted supports and schemes that have been proven to work to address the conservation needs of wild birds. I suppose the first one that started off as the Burren Farming for Conservation program is very well known. And this has been scaled up now. I'll go into that in a minute. I suppose actually I'll just come back a bit. But basically, we've been undertaking work on the ground in a range of projects over the years, and most recently we're still doing the Curlew European Innovation Programme in the Carib, around the Carib, and into Leitrim. And here's a picture of just my colleague Anita talking to farmers and showing them what's needed on the ground, the type of habitat that needs to be created for curlew and other breeding waders. And here is the look at this fabulous curlew and the length of that bill. So here's a curlew being weighed and measured and ringed and tracked in the Carib as part of the project. There are other projects as well involved going on, like the Hen Harrier project in several of the Hen Harrier SPAs, special protection areas. These projects would be funded through EU and national exchequer funding. But it's important to note that every farm has an opportunity to help biodiversity. So I focus there on the priorities for us, but all around the country, every single farm can host biodiversity and can help. And this is what we need actually if we're going to save like the widespread species like kestrel, for example. So here's me giving a talk to young dairy farmers in County Laois on the farm of a farmer there. And there was keen interest to learn more about what they can do on farms. The Bride European Innovation Programme in Cork has been set up by Donald Sheehan, who was a dairy farmer down there, who basically, he said, Oonagh, if we don't do something now, there'll be nothing left in 10 years. So they got European Union and national funding, and the farmers in the area were literally chomping at the bit to get into this scheme. It was oversubscribed. The farmers were dying to do work. And they were very, very keen to get involved. And so here's just a picture of them talking to school children about tree planting in this one area. But other projects that they've done or other actions include like putting in ponds back in the landscape, which has been really great. So just a little bit about CAP. So there, you know, talked about the status, we've talked about, you know, our priorities and what we need to see happening. You know, we've talked a little bit about the types of schemes that help, and the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, I suppose, is the number one policy to try and help direct funding to direct change. I suppose there's also the like Food Vision 2030 agriculture policy, and its predecessor was Food Wise 2025, and prior to that was Food Harvest. So there's been successful agriculture policies as well, shaping the direction of travel. And then the CAP is like the implementation budget, right? To put those into practice, because that's how you divvy out the cash to go to the farmers on the ground. So I sat on the CAP Consultative Committee for the last 2.5 years, and it's just been approved by Cabinet. It's going to be worth 9.8 billion euro between 2023 and 2027. So that's 5 years worth of funding. So the good stuff, and there have been some positives in it. One of the issues that we had with, many people had, was that land eligibility rules for payment before used to kind of, they would allow they would redline farmers or dock pay from farmers if they had certain amount of habitat on their farms. So now that was encouraging the use of burning of habitats, especially in the uplands, because farmers are like, well, I have to get rid of this habitat because I'm not going to be paid for it. So the Department of Agriculture now, with the approval of the European Commission, has said that a farmer will not be docked if they have 50%, if 50% of a hectare is habitat. So it could be scrub, it could be a marsh. Well, you'd really hope there's rules about wetlands, but they're separate. But this is a really good thing, and we really hope that this will deter farmers or encourage farmers to retain habitats. But it's all to be played out. We'll see in the next CAP what happens there, whether it'll be worth it for them not to take out habitat to increase production. So the whole thing is, now we'll find out whether this is actually about, you know, will it be worth more to actually still take out those habitats for the extra funds you can get from increased cow numbers, for example. So that's that tension may still be there. We have to wait and see. So in relation to the other conditions, so there in the CAP, there's conditions for the basic payment that farmers receive. Ireland was really good and went beyond what most European countries did in this one condition called Space for Nature condition. So the CAP regulation was saying that, look, this is just for arable farms. But in Ireland, we have very few arable farms. So this would have meant that most farmland would have not have to undertake this condition. So, but Ireland said, no, we're going to apply it to all farmland. So that's really brilliant. And I think it's the only country, maybe I don't know if Germany did it, but I think it's the only country in the EU that has said this is going to apply to all farmland. So that's really good. One of the big bugbears I've had is that I discovered that, like, you're supposed to retain hedgerows as part of the Common Agricultural Policy. condition 8, but Ireland has been allowing hedgerow removal, 500 meters of hedgerow removal on every farm since 2009. And that is just catastrophic. And so now, with a lot of advocacy from our end, the department has said that it'll only be in very exceptional circumstances that hedgerows can be removed. So we still have to work with them on what those rules are going to look like. They might be just about turning vehicles in close to farm yards, that kind of thing. But retain means retain, and this should be happening. So we're going to be closely watching that, but that's a good win. So in terms of eco schemes, there is more funding being diverted in the CAP, and it's very easy to fall into a trap of jargon on this, and and I'm sorry if I do that, but I'm doing my best trying to not to. But the CAP is divided into 2 pillars. Pillar 1 is kind of the direct payments, is like direct support for farmers, and pillar 2 is like you need to be doing action to get this extra money. So in pillar 1, more money is being diverted towards the environmental goods for that public money, let's say. But unfortunately, we're still seeing that that's, it's not directed towards, let's say, improving habitat. So basically, farmers are still getting rewarded for what's there already. And maybe that's enough at this point to kind of encourage them to retain habitats. But it's not going to help us enough to get where we need to be on restoring habitats. So, for example, the eco schemes are going to, I would say most farmers are probably going to take up the Space for Nature eco scheme because there's a lot of hedgerows in the country, but there's no focus on, and a lot of hedgerows will probably make up this additional Space for Nature, right? But there's no focus on the improving the quality of hedgerows, and we know that that's a real problem. So that's a real shame. And also, Pillar 1 funding goes to 130,000 farmers. Whereas Pillar 2 funding will only go to 50,000 farmers. So you want to get your biggest bang for your buck in Pillar 1, right? That's not happening yet. So then when we look to Pillar 2, then we're looking at the agri-environment scheme. Previous schemes be like GLOS or REPS. Now it's called Acres. What's very exciting is these new cooperative projects, which are going to be scaled up around the country. And that's like more burn life projects all around, like mainly on the West Coast. Let's see, do I have my little images aren't flying in. They're supposed to. Hold on. I think it's stuck again. So anyway, hopefully they'll come in, and they'll all come in at the end probably. There's also going to be a breeding wader European innovation program that for worth 30 million euro, which is one of our big asks in this CAP. That's going to be funded by the Department of Agriculture and National Parks and Wildlife Service. So the not so good stuff. Well, basically, we're still funding mostly the same business as usual. And that's a big concern because we've got targets for climate. We know what's going on with biodiversity. So when you're talking about 9.8 billion euro, we should really be using that pot of funding to be funding transition, to be funding change in direction. And unfortunately, we're kind of not seeing that. In fact, we've done an analysis and we reckon only about 7% of the funding is going to be directed towards effective action on climate, water and biodiversity. And that's mainly going to come from the cooperative projects and the EIPs in Pillar 2 that I mentioned. And that relies on the farm advisory services to really deliver those actions on the ground. In the area of natural constraints scheme, for example, there's 1.4 billion, I think it is, which is mainly money for nothing, which is really, really disappointing. So I can't, my screen is, I don't know what's going on here. Oh, see, I knew it, they'd all come in. So this is the map of the cooperative projects, and you'll see all these different colored bits are where those different geographical areas are. Birdwatch Ireland has undertaken a farmland bird hotspot mapping where we pulled together all the data on the 29 farmland bird species, and these are hotspots showing the top 15% of sites of all of those 29 species. You might think, oh, well, there's not a lot of species, but there's not a lot of areas that are important for birds, but that isn't quite true. This is where we would have most of the species in the top sites. When you look, for example, for barn owl, these are the barn owl's hotspots, and we're using this data to underpin the barn owl nest box scheme that's also in the CAP. So kind of coming towards the end here. So we know that just in relation to climate and other issues, right, and the future. So one of the things, like I've already said how high nature value farming and supporting low input, low intensity grazing is really important. And what we see in a narrative nationally is that, you know, that agriculture, obviously there are changes required, but the focus has really been on, especially in the Climate Change Advisory Council, on targeting the suckler herd. And the suckler herd is like those usually smaller farmers in the west of Ireland. And if we take a really narrow approach, just looking at climate and not looking at the impacts on biodiversity, there could be really negative impacts there. We do need to support some. We know there absolutely needs to be a reduction in cow numbers for sure to bring down emissions. But we really do need to make sure that we just take a more holistic approach, looking at climate, water and biodiversity together. Another thing is a lot of the smaller suckler farmers, their land is then targeted for afforestation. When afforestation, tree planting, whether it's broadleaves or conifers, wipes out those habitats for those breeding waders. It attracts predators like foxes and crows into the landscape, who feed on the prey on the chicks and eggs, and decimating populations even further. So we need to continue to support high nature value farming, which is not just about birds, it's about peat soils, it's about water quality, it's about important areas for flowers, for pollinators, and a range of other insects. So, as I mentioned a little bit there in emissions, like we know the IPCC is saying that in order to have a stable climate, we need to move to a mostly plant-based diet. This will have significant implications for farmer livelihoods and could mean a severe reduction in agriculture output. And this is something that I think if there was a farmer, and I hope hopefully there's some farmers listening in, but like if farmers, when they hear this message, like it's very threatening, you know, because they're just like everybody else who are trying to make ends meet, with issues on farm and in their families, and trying to educate children and all the rest of it that all of us have to address. So I think we need to be really careful on the narrative and support people to help them, because we know that everything has to change and we have to change. Everyone has to change. So I just think it's really important, you know, that we just do this in a constructive way that, you know, just doesn't make a person feel so threatened that their livelihoods, their traditions, the culture, the fact that generations might have been farming could be taken away, and it can't be done glibly. You can't say that glibly, and it can't be done glibly either. So another really important thing that's coming up is the nature restoration law, and we have a huge opportunity to restore nature across Ireland and across Europe. We need our Irish government to take a really strong position on this law, which is coming from the European Union. It will compel member states to restore nature and to invest in nature restoration, and that will have important implications for climate change as well. Farmers also feel threatened by this, but we really need to support them again on that journey. So that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Oonagh. So if you want to, yeah, that's great. Stop sharing. Okay, so we've got a few questions already coming in on the chat. So if you could use the chat function, or also raise your hands if you'd like to come in, but just to get the ball rolling, a question and a comment from Lorna. Due to the work you and other groups do, we know now that we have serious problems here. How do we encourage or force farmers to want to save our environment?
Well, I don't think you force anybody to do anything, because that's not a great, it's really hard to force anybody to do anything. I think you need to use a range of tools and supports to help farmers change direction. And, we also might need to start paying more for food. And that's notwithstanding the fact that some cohorts in our society have difficulty paying for food, and food prices have gone up, and we can see that. But that is always a big issue for farmers, is the price of food that they get back in their pockets. And we've seen some veggie farmers, more and more veggie farmers are going under at the moment because of the below cost selling that's happening in shops. For vegetables, for example, 49 cents for a bag of carrots. The farmer isn't getting very much of that. So I think there's, I was talking to my brother, and even just at a personal level, if my dad was still around today and farming, what would he need to address emissions cuts and water quality and biodiversity? And he would need probably somebody to come on farm and say, right, this is what needs to happen. This is what you've got. This is what you can do. It's kind of like that bespoke approach, with the advisory services, knowing what's going on that farm is, I think, probably what's key. And we have to really make sure as well, farmers retain dignity in their work. Like, everybody wants a dignified life, and we have to respect the fact that they have ambitions as well to, be their best. So we have to really make sure we bring people along the way.
Thanks, Oonagh. And I just a follow-up question on that from Patrick Fahy. So just following on the point around the cost of food. So his comment is, I've heard farmers say that food is too cheap, and environmentalists say that the cost to our planet isn't included in the price. So surely there would be massive buy-in from farmers if they received this cost to produce sustainable food. I think this is a great question. It's also a really big question. What are the barriers to a new system?
Oh my gosh.
How much time do we have?
I need another hour. Well, barriers. Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think the cheap food policy is a barrier. I think addressing price is really tricky, because that's done kind of at a global level. We're in a global market. So even when we're talking about demand reduction, we're talking about, butter is one of the primary exports of the country. So when we're talking about demand reduction for meat and dairy products, you're talking about at a European global level to encourage a change in diet. So price is important. Unfair trading practices committee, after being set up by Charlie McConalogue to the Minister for Agriculture to try and address some of this, but price is a kind of a problem of our economic system, where the costs of an environmental degradation aren't factored into price. That's probably beyond my pay grade now to try and answer that. But I also think other barriers, like when it comes to the same with water pollution, again, the cost of that isn't seen through price as well. So it's just a bigger economic question. I think the NGOs are doing our environmental organizations like Birdwatch Ireland and others are doing their best to advocate for change in the law. We need every single person to be advocating and telling their politicians that we need, that you want to see more nature, not less, that we want to see policies that protect biodiversity. I mean, a big thing is demand from people for more nature, for better biodiversity, for breeding waders, for habitats, because a lot of this is political decisions too. So every single one of us can be advocates, and I'd please ask every single one of you to tell your politicians that, write to them, email them, talk to them when you see them, that this is what we need.
Thanks for that, Oonagh. There's a question here from Rebecca. Are there natural ways other than keeping food stored in metal bins to manage rodents in an equestrian environment to avoid the rodenticide you mentioned?
There is a campaign called the Campaign for Responsible Rodenticide Use that my colleague John Lusby is involved in. And you might be able to get some information online about that. I'm sure there's ways and means of controlling rodenticide use on farms. So I just don't have that information, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a really good recommendation. So thanks for that. There is a question here around city and county councils are brutally damaging hedgerows. Is there any push to change that? They don't seem to adhere to the Wildlife Act that protects them.
Well, the Wildlife Act needs to be stronger. That's one thing. But for road safety concerns, hedge cutting is allowed in any part of the country, even during the breeding period for birds. What we find is that can sometimes be abused a little bit, where we don't really know if there is a road safety issue. The roads look very wide. So I think it's education and awareness raising there with the county councils, and also risk assessments on is there an actual safety concern. So that's what I think needs to happen. But, you know, there's just the capacity within local authorities to address environmental matters. There's just not enough people working at doing this. Needs to be more ecologists working in local authorities, right up to all of the planning authorities. You know, that's where we need to see that advice filtering through to the local area engineers on the ground, who are the ones, you know, commissioning the contractors to do the work. So it's that kind of structure. We need to have it infiltrated in every part of the structure, and it's a bit of a job of work, but hopefully, you know, more awareness will help with that.
Okay. So we have time for a few more questions here, just a couple more. One from Anne. What are the measures being taken to protect and increase our populations of curlew and corncrake? And I know, Oonagh, you'll love this question.
Can you say the question again? Sorry,
yeah.
Karen.
Yeah, what are the measures being taken to protect and increase our populations of curlew and corncrake?
Okay, so in relation to corncrake, there's a corncrake life project being which is going on at the moment up in Inishboffin, Galway, Mayo and Donegal, I believe, where they're working with farmers to increase the habitats needed for corncrake, but also to support farmers not to mow the fields, because what happens is tractors go out in the fields. These are ground nesting birds. Tractors go out in the fields, and they are sometimes can mow over the birds, which is not good. They're literally killed by machinery. So again, it's about awareness raising and working with farmers that they don't mow or do center out mowing. So work from the middle of the field out, so it gives a chance for the birds and the chicks to escape. And it's just about awareness raising again there. So there's a lot of money going into that. So there's the Curlew European Innovation Programme that we're undertaking at the moment, and that's going to scale up then to the breeding wader EIP. I know a lot of acronyms. That's going to be 30 million. That's the biggest, that's a huge amount of money, the most amount of money that we've seen going towards breeding waders ever. So I really hope that'll do the work. One of the things we have to do in relation to breeding waders is to undertake predator control. So especially around nest sites, because I already mentioned how foxes and crows will target chicks and eggs. So unfortunately, from time to time, we have to shoot foxes and crows under license, very targeted towards, individual species. This is not like a widespread thing, and it's all done under license, but it is unfortunately a necessity if we're going to save these birds. And again, the foxes and crows are there because of increased cover now from afforestation in the wider landscape, and crows love open landscapes as well. So they are thriving compared to crows across Europe. crows in Ireland are thriving. They're not thriving across Europe. They are thriving here because of the amount of grasslands we have. So the imbalance in the landscape is creating an imbalance in how we're in trying to protect species too. So these are some of the measures we're trying to undertake.
So I just wanted to read a couple of the comments that are coming in on the chat. It's a really interesting conversation, and thanks so much for everybody for contributing. A lot of thank you, Oonagh, for your time and for sharing your knowledge. Another comment from Fiona, very well put, Oonagh, thank you. It's critical not to focus on a single target, e.g. reducing emissions when it comes to addressing complicated issues, but like the climate and biodiversity crisis. And another comment I really wanted to reflect was very informative and thought-provoking. Your empathy with farmers is to be appreciated by all. They're often targeted as causing all the issues. Your background has given you a wider view. Thank you for that. There's also some suggestions to check out the Galway Barn Owl projects and others like it throughout the country, which are working with landowners to assess sites for suitability to erect barn boxes. So I wanted to say there's one question here that I thought might be interesting to give over to you, Oonagh, and that is, I've lost it here. Sorry. Oh yeah. Have you seen any examples of low intensity sheep grazing that benefits wildlife? For example, lapwings prefer a short sward.
I haven't myself, just because I haven't been out there looking. I don't get, like, you might think I get out a lot looking at all these things. I don't. All my colleagues are out there doing the fab work, survey and monitoring and conservation. I'm sitting behind a computer usually. So if there are for sure examples of projects that are good for, that work with, like the Machair Life project. Machair is M-A-C-H-A-I-R, fabulous coastal grassland habitat in Ireland and Scotland, only in the world. Like, I mean, globally important habitats in the Northwest. And so there is usually sheep grazing there, some cattle, but usually sheep. So you will, that project will be doing work there, and that habitat is also really good for lapwing and other breeding waders. So there's definitely projects happening on the ground. There are techniques there to help.
Thanks, Oonagh. And there's one more question here, and we have time for one more question. And it's around supporting farmers to change. So there's a comment, Food Vision 2030 doesn't support herd reduction. In fact, it goes out of the way to talk of the value to people's health of dairy, etc. And there was another comment about expansion and exports. So how will farmers be encouraged to do the right thing around just transition, etc., if we're not really tackling the problem?
This is really tricky. And I would just say, Birdwatch was involved in the background when the IEN, the environmental pillar, was sitting on the Food Vision 2030 strategy development. And we know that some of the farming organizations there didn't feel that those food strategies were really delivering for farmers. They're delivering for the industry, but not for farmers. We saw on a public consultation on that food strategy that most of the responses from farmers, now it was only 200 or so respondents, and I think something like 60% of them said they were primary producers, either like farmers or fishers, but so it's a snapshot, okay, but not totally representative. But most of those farmers said that they don't feel served by these policies at all. So I think we need to have a look again about putting the farmer central to policies and supporting them to do the right thing. I think the just transition is going to be very important, but I haven't really seen us do that very well yet. Even when it comes to turf cutting, there was a cliff edge. Cliff edges aren't good. We've been warning about problems for so long, that now they, you know, they hit the wall, and, you know, people take decisions, governments take decisions that are very fast and have huge implications for people. We really can't be doing that with, you know, with any sector. It's just not fair. People need to plan, they have lives, they have commitments. But we need to have the conversation now. And I feel that maybe some of the farming representative organizations haven't been helpful either in recognizing that it's not just about farming causing the problems, right? But that climate change as well is going to make farming difficult, and it's going to make farming change as well. And we need to build resilience. If we want farmers grow food, we need to support them to grow the food we want.
Thanks, Oonagh. I think that's a really powerful message to finish on this afternoon. I'd also like to encourage everyone, if you'd like to hear more about the work that Oonagh does with her colleagues at Birdwatch Ireland, and to join their work, to join Birdwatch, you can do that. You can become a member, and you can give your time and money, a small amount of each, and really support the work that Oonagh and her team do to change policy for the better for birds and their habitats. So that's one thing that we can do as individuals and a community. Another thing that I would strongly encourage you to do is to make a submission to the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity this autumn, to share your thoughts on nature, on what we need to do to change policy for the better. Now, these recommendations that the Citizens Assembly are hearing from us, from the people, will go to government. So I'm going to share with you a link to our website with lots of information and resources on how you can do that and how you can make your voices heard. So one thing, join Birdwatch. Second thing, make a submission. And we have our next and final webinar next week, next Wednesday, where we're going to hear from Patrick Earls about health and biodiversity. So he is a GP and he's involved with Irish doctors for the Irish environment. I'm really looking forward to hearing the talk. I'd like to also thank Oonagh, especially for all your time this afternoon and for sharing your expansive knowledge with us. I really enjoyed today's talk, and for all of you for joining us and contributing to this conversation.
Can I just add, Karen, here's the link to the Birdwatch Ireland submission to the Citizens Assembly as well. I'll just include that in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Oonagh. Thanks a million, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Don't forget to be advocates for nature.